Ultra Sun and Moon, the double curveball games. Game Freak have a history of churning out third versions, but with all the unexpected moves that they've pulled the last few years, the first sequels in the series, no third version at all for Gen 6, Hoenn remakes out of nowhere, there's really no telling what they have hidden up their sleeves. So even with a track record of 5 out of 6 paired games getting a follow-up, I have to hold my hands up and say I didn't see this one coming. But how exactly do I feel about these games? Well, somehow, I'm sure you already know that's what I'm going to be having a talk about today. There are going to be 2 parts within this video, the non-spoiler section and the spoiler section. I consider spoilers to be anything related to major plot points or new features that haven't already been acknowledged by the Pokemon Company prior to the game's release. Another disclaimer is that I'm going to be sharing my experience of the game, so irrespective of spoilers, if you want to go into these games completely blind, I would recommend adding this to your watch later list. Does anyone actually use those? As a lifelong Pokemon fan, it's a little intimidating for me to say this, but Ultra Sun and Moon, or well, Ultra Moon, which is where my experience was focused, were the only main installments of the whole series that I didn't play non-stop from the moment that I bought them. I think this is in part due to disinterest from the expectation I'd find them boring because of everyone and their grandma saying that they were, perhaps because I didn't pressurize myself to pump out a Let's Play and just chilled with it, perhaps because I'm not a child anymore and I have other priorities like making food. I'm guessing all of them. I don't know how I can fairly judge these games because in comparison to the majority of other improved versions, they follow suit. But coming off the back of the last follow-ups in the series was a lot of pressure and I don't know if they ever could have lived up to it. Black and White 2 weren't improved versions. They were straight up sequels with an entirely new story and protagonists. They set the bar to a ridiculous height, so I don't think it's any wonder a lot of people seem upset. But it does make me ponder, did people have the same reaction to games like Emerald? Platinum? They made far fewer changes than Ultra Sun and Moon did, but they're seen as classics nowadays. And once the dust does settle, I hope that people will try and see Ultra Sun and Moon for what they really are, improved versions of Sun and Moon, not sequels like Black and White 2. A lot, if not all of the criticisms that I have for Ultra Sun and Moon are ones that I have for the originals too. And because these are extremely similar games, it's only natural that they'd be amplified when I've already played both Sun and Moon. The pacing of the first island is as slow as ever and it took me a while to break free of it. The constant cutscenes and tutorials made me want to bash my head into the wall. I'm probably in the minority when I say I'm not a fan of how they strayed away from having a linear region design. And I don't mean because they're islands instead of one connected region, but just generally how each island is set out. Alola's routes feel like they're all connected, and I can see why this would appeal to a lot of people. Having the paths curved, some areas at different elevations and so on makes the game look so much more realistic, but personally, I find it a little disorientating. I pretty frequently find myself getting lost, which is why I'm guessing they have the Rotom map at the bottom. Even if they weren't as realistic, I find the overall graphics of, say, X and Y a lot more pleasant to navigate most of the time. Most. On a similar topic of aesthetics, right from the first trailer, I had my hopes up. I wasn't the biggest fan of the way that Alola looked in the originals. It was far more realistic, but at the cost of having some areas look quite bland. But now in some places you can almost feel the colors jump out at you and it makes the game feel so much more alive. Ultra Sun and Moon pushed the 3DS to its absolute limit graphically, and this has its pros and cons. The cutscenes are absolutely gorgeous, but as with Sun and Moon, the lag with double battles is painful. It's so bad that Game Freak couldn't develop these games in 3D at all, and I'm willing to bet it's why triple and rotation battles, as well as hordes, didn't return from Gen 6. Maybe it's better if you use a new 3DS, but as someone who played it on the original model, it was extremely noticeable. An area I saw drastic change over Sun and Moon would be the overall difficulty. My track record with the experience share isn't the greatest. Around 2 years ago, I mentioned in a video how I wanted Game Freak to revert this item to how it was prior to Gen 6 because it made playthroughs far too easy. If the experience share is going to return, then we don't want it to be the same as it was in Generation 6. Or at the very least, let us decide what Pokemon we actually want to gain the extra experience, instead of just sharing it with the entire team by default. It would make the experience of the game as a whole a lot more rewarding. And yeah, sure, you could turn it off, but I only ever wanted to be able to toggle it, so that it only gives one Pokemon extra experience instead of just over-leveling your whole team. Needless to say, a lot of people reacted quite badly to this. Sun and Moon gave me a much more challenging experience than X and Y did, but Ultra Sun and Moon upped it several notches again. I had my experience share on for the whole game and found some parts extremely difficult. I don't even want to attempt these games with it turned off. Like Platinum and Black and White 2 before them, Ultra Sun and Moon have an expanded Pokédex. Even if you don't decide to use any of the new Pokemon, it still makes makes a world of difference because a lot of significant characters have new teams now. This helps to keep the games fresh if you played Sun and Moon. A criticism I have about the Pokédex is that somehow we still didn't get a national mode. The Gen 7 games are the only games in the series to do this, and I can't say that I'm a fan. In some ways, I think it destroys the collecting element of Pokemon because there's no incentive at all. Why bother transferring hundreds of Pokemon outside of Alola if you don't get a certificate at the end, or even get to see them in the Dex? I could be being way too cynical when I say that the national Dex may have been cut so that Game Freak could save time on composing hundreds of new entries and making those cool poses for every Pokemon, but either way, it's disappointing. Let's talk about new features. The Alola Photo Club is a beautiful place. I'm sure it's not for everyone, but I had a total blast taking pictures and putting decorative little stickies on them. They're all adorable, and you can really feel how much love and creative thought went into designing them. Mantine Surf is also super fun, even if I'm not that good at it. And surprise, surprise, I love the Ultra Warp Ride too. Like in Oras, they found an excuse to shove a bunch of legendaries in the game, but I feel like this is far more fitting than Oras' contribution. Like, I don't even think that Mirage spots are explained in game at all. I know they're to do with Hoopa, but why? Ultra Wormholes are also this generation's method of broken as heck shiny hunting, but it's only to a very limited group of Pokemon and doesn't impact the legendary, so I don't really care. I can praise a Game Freak to actually have shinies be relatively rare again all I want, but it's probably never gonna happen, so why get annoyed about it? If you're like me and enjoy finding shinies at full odds, then just look for them in older games. Simple as. I don't think that shiny hunting should make or break a game, and personally I like to believe that Game Freak started locking the title legendaries and some others so that you could actually focus on the story. Or as a marketing tactic of the same thing, right? Ooh, now it's time for the spoiler section, you've been warned. So here I'm just not gonna hold back with spoilers at all, okay? Like I said, the bulk of the main story is extremely similar. I personally find Melee Melee a little bit tedious, but it was slightly more bearable with the appearances from the Ultra Recon, these guys peppered throughout. Their theme is so cool, by the way, but as characters, I think they're pretty unnecessary. Their only real purpose is to spout out lore about Necrozma and introduce you to Ultra Warp Ride. Individually, they don't really leave much of an impression on me. Some totems return from the originals, while other trials have completely new ones. They were genuinely challenging, and I had a tough time with some of them in Sun and Moon. Even the totems that stay the same can call in new allies thanks to the expanded Pokédex. So even if you have played Sun and Moon before, you have to adapt your strategy. A lot of the trials have new puzzles as well, which was a detail that I greatly appreciated. You have the odd appearance from these guys throughout the story, but obviously the main differences come at the climax at Aether Foundation. And I have to say that I love the way that they handled the family dynamic between Gladion, Lily, and Luzamine. Luzamine's hardly a protagonist, but her character has changed so that she's only bitter over Lily and Gladion running away, instead of being straight up crazy about her precious beasts. This time she has tasked herself with the ultimate goal of protecting all of Alola from Necrozma. Whether or not she does this for her own selfish reasons is questionable, but it makes her feel more human. Here, it is clear to see that despite her anger toward their betrayal, her love for her children, even if it is overshadowed by how neglectful she is as a mother, is still intact and genuine. A small gripe I had about the originals was that Gladion didn't seem too involved when it came to the other characters as part of the family dynamic, but it was enjoyable seeing him get more focus in this respect to help show that he's not all about being razor-sharp, edgy boy, but actually has a softer side, and cares pretty deeply for his family too. It was also nice to finally get a resolution to the Mohn mystery, be it a very bittersweet one. I found it very interesting that for the first time in the series, Game Freak chose to directly villainize a Pokemon, and attribute the events that take place to its own will. Legendaries have been at the forefront of the story since Generation 3, but their reasons for causing widespread chaos could always be pinned directly on the actions of the villainous teams. And sure, you could argue that Luzamine probably did provoke Necrozma, but it was referenced earlier on in the story that Alola was already at risk of losing its light to Necrozma anyway. Whether or not it can control itself, or has malicious intent in its quest to devour light is debatable, but I don't think that Game Freak wants us to view it as an evil Pokemon. For starters, it would definitely be a dark type, and the act of giving Alola the gifts of Z-Power and the Totem Pokemon clearly shows that it does have some good intentions. I've gotta say that I do prefer the climax of Sun and Moon though. Could be because the concept of Mother Beast is unlike anything ever seen in Pokemon before. When you find out that Luzamine is such a terrible mother because she was infected with Nihilego's toxins, you can give her a bit of leeway. But while in Ultra Sun and Moon she has gone up in my opinion, she's still an awful mother figure and this time doesn't really have much of an excuse for it. Also, Ultra Megalopolis Metropolis was hyped up to be way more than it actually was. It's pretty much just a fancy stage for Ultra Necrozma, so for me it was a bit of a letdown. It was nice to finally see Mina get her own trial, even if she doesn't really do much. Mount Lanakila has much more purpose in these games and doesn't just feel like a mere connector between Tapu Village and the Pokemon League, like it did in Sun and Moon. Because with a theme like this one, it really deserved more development. Seeing a change in the Elite Four lineup was pretty pleasing. Since this is actually the first time they've done this in a follow-up, discounting champions of course, Hala already gets a lot more screen time than the other kahunas with him being Hal's grandfather, so I was pleasantly surprised to see Mulling come out of the shadows this time. As for the champion battle, it made me so happy. How is just cinnamon roll is overused these days. A mini roll. I don't think you can even get them outside the UK, but he's a mini roll. How is a precious little mini roll with the purest cream center imaginable. While it still follows what Sun and Moon set up, with you taking on your first challenge as champion, it felt so fitting and right for it to be How. A lot more focus is put on How later on in the story with his efforts to get serious and become stronger, even managing to beat Hala when he really matures and steps up to the challenge. I feel quite smug myself because I predicted he would be the final battle too. During this game, I've had to take a lot of notes so that I can try and make a version differences video eventually, and I noticed that the final battle with How outside the Pokemon League was missing. Obviously, my mind went wild with this, so I put it in my notes. And you know what? Game Freak almost had me. They fool you into thinking it's Kukui you're battling, and then at the last second, never mind, it's actually How. The credit scene was absolutely beautiful and gave me serious vibes of Heart Gold and Soul Silvers. I adored Sun and Moon's beautiful art, but I wasn't left disappointed with these stunning sprite artworks. There is some serious talent going on at Game Freak for sure. And the post-game. I was pleasantly surprised by this. Team Rainbow Rocket begins by taking over the Festival Plaza, and you have to use the new battle agency to beat them. Bearing in mind I played through this blind, I was worried that this would be where the whole aftergame would take place, but fortunately it just seems to be a forced way to get people to try out this new facility at least once. Most of it takes place in the Aether Foundation. They've constructed this massive castle with you having to navigate different sections in order to get to the team leaders. It's very reminiscent of past hideout puzzles, and the team leaders are no pushovers. I loved that they featured new remixes for all of them, which isn't something that they normally do for returning themes. They could have easily gotten away with using the original Lysander theme, considering it was only one generation ago on the same console, but the fact that Game Freak spent time to rework it really shows their attention to detail in these games. I honestly have to say that the Rainbow Rocket segment was probably the most fun I had playing the whole game. Seeing Maxie and Archie in their original Gen 3 designs really made me smile too. But to summarize, I think that Ultra Sun and Moon truly did deliver what they promised. Improved versions of Sun and Moon. I think that they will go down favorably, but it'll probably take a good few years for everyone to truly look back and appreciate it for what it is. Think Gen 5. It got an enormous amount of hate from fans during its time, but nowadays you'll see a lot of people praising it for its innovative characters, Pokemon, and for showing us how good Pokemon games can be with a greater focus on the plot and recurring themes. In their case, truths and ideals. Instead of relying solely on the narrative of bad guys want to take over the world, you gotta be the hero or something. I know I'm talking a lot about Generation 5, but Gen 7 and Gen 5 are more alike than you'd think. Both have 2 original games and 2 follow-ups as the only games in their generation. Both were the final Pokemon games on their respective consoles. Both dared to challenge norms that we'd come to accept as part of a Pokemon game, the lack of any returning Pokemon in Gen 5's main story, and the lack of gyms in Gen 7, and in my opinion they're both far more plot-driven than any of the other generations. I think that even I was a little too harsh on these games going into them, but for what they are, Ultra Sun and Moon are great games. As is the case with pretty much all games with follow-up versions, on the whole, I would recommend these over Sun and Moon, even if I do prefer the way that the story plays out in those games. They're far more challenging, the mini-games are some of my favorites in the series, Rainbow Rocket made for a far superior post-game, and I could go on for ages. I'm way too indecisive to give these games a number-based score, so I give these games the score of a white chocolate Oreo. I really like those, but like a lot of things, you can't get them in the UK. But that's it for my overview thingy. These games were a lot of fun though. Christmas is soon. I feel like the days are slipping through my fingers. Happy holidays, friends. What do you guys do for Christmas? Mine are usually filled with too much food and bad cracker jokes. Thanks so much for all the amazing art. I aspire to be as skilled as all of you one day. Okay, I've run out of things to say. Thanks for watching, bye.